Thank you, Kamran. We want to begin with a very hot question that everyone is discussing in Pakistan these days,
Mhm.
and that is why are we indebted so much? Why can't we pay back our debt? What is the problem? What is the structure and dynamics of our national debt?
All right. Fayaz, as I told you before, first of all, I would like to make a disclosure and a point uh, so that you know, I'm not a professional economist. To
Yeah, sure.
first,
Right.
but however, because of my professional engagements in the past, my professional life, I was associated with banking and finance industry, and somehow because of my professional engagements, I got the opportunity to deal primarily with investment banking, corporate finance, and government of Pakistan's loan portfolio. At one point of time, I was privileged or not so privileged. It depends how you look at it. I was managing the government of Pakistan's largest private sector foreign loan portfolio.
Okay, great. That's wonderful. That's
So
what we need.
I know from
Yeah,
inside the issues. However, still would like to make a point that I'm not an economist. So my
that's fine.
perspective will be from a practitioner point of view.
Yes,
Pakistan's debt burden is because of certain factors that we are not earning enough revenue or income, just like a person. And I have seen and I have experienced individual finances, corporate finances, and state sector finances. And I think that the essential is identical, same. The way a person earns money from whatever enterprise, and if that income is less than the expenditure, then that person has to borrow.
yeah,
Similarly, a business enterprise does that, or a country or a state does that. The other reason for borrowing is usually for investment and development. Just like a businessman or a group decides to set up a new industry, he raises certain amount for it as a equity capital and goes to the financial institutions, borrows a certain amount, successfully implements that project, earns a good money, pays off its debt or interest, and then perpetually earns income from that project, and that cycle continues. So
right.
I think the exactly similar ways states also do that. So some countries borrow in spite of the fact that they have good amounts or reserves of money, but then they invest that money and to increase or enhance their income potentials.
Right.
But certain countries like ours and many others in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, they borrow money because they fall short of their income versus their expenditure. We fall in that category. Uh, so our major issue, primary issue, fundamental issue is that our revenue is much less than an ordinary country's expenditure. There is a lot of talk that there is a wastage of money, there is misappropriations, and there are not right priorities in expenditure. All those things are fine. But my perspective is that even if we spend all the money right way, but given the same amount of money and not increased income, we will still fall short of our expenditure.
Right.
So our predicament is twofold. It's a double whammy. We are by definition earning less than our expenditure, which should be an ordinary expenditure. Expenditure of a state should be on its education, health, infrastructure, and development of assets for future earnings. So for a reasonable amount of expenditure, our revenue falls short of that. On top of it, much of it is wasted.
Right.
So it's a double whammy. It's a double sword. So we'll try to analyze and discuss those issues. Primarily, it emanates, as in your question, it is also rightly pointed out that Pakistan's tax to GDP ratio has hovered around 10% during the past 75 years.
Right.
And your question was, can you tell us how much in this ratio has been contributed by 1, 2, 3, 4?
Right.
It's true that, very right, that our tax to GDP ratio is now about 10%. Earlier, it was even less. So we have progressively moved from starting with perhaps about 6, and then to 7 and 8 and 9, and with lots of difficulties. But for a long time, we are now almost at constant level of about, on an average, 10%. Once in a while, it shoots up to 11 or sometimes to even 12. But that is because of the other factors, not that revenue has increased. The GDP somehow, in certain years, reduced while taxes were collected for the previous year. So the ratio increases. But generally, if you take the average, it is about 10% and sometimes
Right.
even less. And if you look at its correct, this figure in its correct perspective, all development financial institutions, all professional economists, and international donor agencies, for a number of years, when they researched about a developing economy like Pakistan, they reached to the conclusion that for any country, in whatever circumstances, for a developing country, minimum 15% should be their tax to GDP ratio. That is,
Right.
that they should collect, that those countries must collect at least 15% of their total overall economy, just to be at a surviving basic level.
Right.
Ideally, it should be more than that. And many countries, as you know, developed countries, many countries are 27%, 30%, 35%. But usually 15 to 20% is considered a reasonable good base.
Right.
22% is reasonably mid-level. You can invest in education required amounts. You can invest in your health sector and other things. But anything below 15 is a hard struggle for that country, no matter how it is spent.
Right.
And on top of it, most of these countries like Pakistan steals, waste that 10% also. So if we look at it, I have done a little numbers analysis based
Okay.
on the Pakistan's economics survey. So this is the revenue of as percentage of GDP. I've taken in the last about 6 years, starting from 2017. I have the data for the about last 30, 40 years as well.
Okay.
And you can see that it is tax is the first row, which is 10.4, 10.8. Here, when I say taxes, the Federal Bureau of Revenue's tax
Statistics. Yeah.
collection, direct
Okay.
or indirect taxes. It is
All
income
right.
tax, sales tax, central excise duty, or whatever. And then there is a non-tax. Non-tax income of any country is that income which it earns from fees. For example, they allow a telecommunication company to operate in Pakistan like Telenor or others, and they pay a certain fee. We also
Okay.
pay different fees, charges for doing certain things. So these are called non-tax revenues.
Right.
So tax revenue is if you see the line is almost flat, 10%, 10.8, 9.7, 9.3, 9.4, 10.1. And non-taxes, including that, so the total is about 13.9, 13.3, 13.2, 12. So this is our, historically, this is our income level for the last about 10, 15, 20, 30 years. Not much of a difference. Of course, numbers are sometimes fudged by the government. So, and I have witnessed it happening, sitting in the Ministry of Finance many times. Personally, I have seen the numbers were being collected for the budget exercise. And my friends who were in the Ministry of Finance, who were joint secretaries, deputy secretaries at that time, I'm talking about early 90s when I was dealing with the federal government's loans. And there were many friends. So I've seen those exercises and they say, okay, put it this much and let it go, it's okay. And I asked them, yeah, this is a budget exercise. What are you doing? He said, no, what do we do here? We don't have any means to collect the actual data. And we have provided it the last years, previous years, we have to be a bit consistent also. So this is it,
But
more or less.
Kamran, how do they
Yes.
collect data? Where do these numbers come from?
Look, there is a lot of talk that the numbers are fudged or not real. To a certain extent, I agree with that. Yes, it is true. But the numbers are collected primarily by the Central Bureau of Statistics in Pakistan, like any other country. They
Right.
collect from Customs Department, Central Excise Department, Federal Bureau of Revenue, FBR, in terms of revenues. Similarly, other non-tax incomes from other regulatory departments like Telecommunication Authority or Motor Vehicles Department or other. And these numbers, with all their faults, generally indicate the trend. Exactly the number may not be correct. For example,
Right.
this 10.4 tax revenue could be actually 10.2, 10.1, 10.5. But broadly speaking, the numbers relationship remain consistent.
Okay.
So this is
But
the official way of collecting data. And then, and similarly, State Bank of Pakistan maintains its data. And then these all data are corroborated, compiled together, and then the economic surveys of Pakistan are issued prior to a month before budget exercise, and then the budgets are made. Typically, this is the practice everywhere in the world.
okay.
And then there are international agencies, you know, that since we have borrowed a lot of money, so other international agencies are now also directly involved because of having their stakes. So they do
Okay.
also independently check whether this data, how correct is that data.
Okay.
And then they do the snap checking through their private consultants, uh, through private contractors that go out and check whether these data collected by the government in these previous years, how far it's true. So they cannot replicate the entire exercise 100%, but they do snap checking.
Okay.
And then they come back with a report that, yes, here was a problem. It is not exactly this, but broadly, this is the indication. Then there's a
All right.
third method of doing that, which normally private organizations do that. And as a senior banker in Pakistan, about 26 years of my service, International Bank, we have also had various methods of collecting data, not for economic purpose, but for assessing our own market size and our own strategies. So same
Okay.
way, the Citibank is also doing, Bank of America is also doing, IMF, World Bank, Asian Development Bank. They are all doing these kinds of market surveys to
All right.
test the veracity of the data collected by any country. And they're doing it everywhere. And then
Okay.
data is mostly manipulated in those areas which have a political implication.
Okay.
Otherwise, the governments do not have much of an incentive to dramatically change the data.
All
They
right.
tweak a little just to present it more in a more rosy picture compared to the previous regime. Yes, they do that. That show it this way and put it here so that our exports or income is shown better than the previous. These things they do, but at the end, the total remains the same. So it's
Okay.
most of a issue of presentations and some fictitious data creeps in. 100% accurate. I don't think there is any country in the world, but it's a degree of correctness. Pakistan is perhaps not very accurate, but broadly speaking, it's the issue. Mostly the data manipulation comes, say, for example, in terms of population census, because it has direct implication on the number of constituencies the constitution allows to a certain region, city, or rural, urban, uh, different ethnic regions. So their manipulation comes in a bigger way.
Okay.
And for that, we used to do it. We used to engage private consultants to assess a population of a certain area. For example, if we are opening branches in southern Punjab, so we need to have a correct assessment of the total population size, their spending power, their wealth. So they used to collect data relating to, for example, how many motorcycles are being sold in that region, how much tea is consumed in that region, how much edible oil is sold in that region, how many cars are registered in that region, and then there are statistical method to extrapolate that based on these numbers, the population size should be around this.
Okay.
And of these, so many household must have this level of income to afford this much. So there are methods of what we call stress checking of the data. And whenever we did that exercise, that kind of exercise, we found that in terms of population statistics, huge differences came up. That the
Okay.
data was indicating a totally different picture, but government statistics were coming different. But in terms of revenue and expenditure, I don't really think in totals there is a major difference.
Okay.
Expenditure, yes, you can reallocate like an accountant. We used to do it, that show this expenditure not here, here. Total will remain the same, but this will look like that this we are spending on this side. So that kind of exercise is done. So coming back to this is the level, and this is very consistent in the last about 30, 40 years. So I don't think that there is a major gap with reality. And then if it is compared with our expenditure side, we'll come to that part later. The line below in red gives you a figure of the deficit. So we are running consistently a deficit between our income and our expenditure. We'll come to the expenditure side later and what
Okay.
constitutes it and how we can improve it. But the fact would remain, if we put expenditure from head A to B, even then total will remain the same.
Right.
So we can do those tweakings, but totals will not change much. So this is the gap which is consistently increasing.
Okay.
So here comes the issue of debt. So you have no escape from borrowing. And there is only one, theoretically, there are only two ways of doing it. One, you reduce, like an individual, either you reduce your expenditure. If you are wasting your money, if you are earning, say, for example, in Canada, $5,000 a month, and your expenditure is 7,000, so you are running a shortfall of 3,000 every 2,000 every month. So either you reduce your expenditure, bring down your quality of life lower and at par with your income level, or you increase your income. Or to
Right.
meet short-term needs, You must borrow. Either go to a bank or a friend or a family or parent, whatever. So we'll come to the expenditure side later, but this is what it is. That's how the debt uh, emanates.
Okay. All right.
Now, in terms of debt also, I have seen that among many of our intellectuals, non-professional, and especially those coming from the political activism side, like myself, I was also part of the progressive movement from very early stages of my youth. And we have a certain perspectives, and we criticize governments from a certain perspectives and everything. So sometimes I've seen that when they talk about debt, they they do not distinguish between two types of debts of a state. We must understand that to put it in correct perspective. One debt is in domestic debt, which we call earning in Pak rupees. Every government borrows from its banks or central bank to meet its expenditure. It is always in the local currency. So, to me, in my experience, domestic debt is not that it's not an issue, but it is not that big an issue because it
Okay.
is payable in same currency, which is country's own currency, and it is only actually it's a perpetual debt which people put in the banks, their savings, or in countries like Pakistan, they buy defense savings certificates, savings schemes, NIT schemes, and those kinds of things. And this is actually a government debt. So US runs the world's largest debt in its own country. Australia has a huge debt of its own currency. This does not threaten in a big way a country's sovereignty or its decision-making ability. But what actually does harm a country's sovereignty and independence, it's its foreign debt. If that foreign debt exceeds more than a limit, then the country becomes dependent on other countries. So that is the actual debt component we should always keep in mind. Domestic debt, if it is spent well, it's not bad. Even I would say even foreign currency debt, if it is borrowed with good intentions and spent well for investment and enhancing your revenue potentials, it is not bad.
Right.
Germany and Japan after World War and all of Europe were the biggest borrowers of foreign currency to rebuild their countries. The largest debt raised in the world at that time was for Europe.
Yeah.
And then they spent it to rebuild, to enhance their income, and they came out of it. So it is per se not very bad. It is how you spend and why you borrow. And here comes the difference. So I will mostly focus on foreign debt component and not on local debt. And if you look at the debt side, I will show you a little picture here. These numbers are based on 2022-2023 economic survey, which was based on March 2023 and issued in June this year.
Okay.
So it is the latest government's account. Population, employed labor, you can see the other problems is the population is 229, which is roughly estimated more than that. Rather than 229 million, it is estimated at about no less than 240 to 50 million actually.
Okay.
But however, it's 37% of it is urban, and 63% of this population is rural. Here again, in our experience, in my consistent banking experience, I have found that these numbers are fudged. The urban is much more than what we are stating.
Right. It's much larger.
But
yeah.
much larger, but we are, for political reasons, certain areas, for example, particularly in Sindh uh, and also in Punjab, they want to show more rural population for retaining a certain amount of voting power in their
Right.
hands. So
Yeah.
they downplay that, and they downplay urban, and because of the ethnic conflict there. So here
Right.
comes the politics of population census. But anyway, it is estimated that actually the urban population is about many institutions, independent institutions, international students, institutions have estimated that it's roughly about 44% of Pakistan's population is now urban, not rural.
Okay.
And it is estimated that by maximum by 2050, more than 50% of Pakistan's population will be urban.
Right.
The trend in the last about 30, 40 years, population growth and expansion of cities, it is estimated that perhaps earlier than 2050, Pakistan's more than 50% population will be living in cities. Anyway, that's a different issue. If you look at the debt, all government agencies provide the debt, total domestic plus foreign currency debt defined in Pak rupees. So the latest debt is 59 trillion. It is 59,247 billion of Pak rupees, which
Okay.
is 74% of the total GDP, which looks very high, although many European countries have more than 100% of their GDP debt, like Greece and Spain and others. But still, 74% of a country's GDP in debt is a high number.